Welcome to Block Time. So if you read the news, then you probably heard that Bitcoin is dead. I probably read that every couple of months, that there's a new news story that compares Bitcoin to some other commodity, some historical event, and concludes that the Bitcoin bubble has burst or is about to burst, and we're going to see a huge downswing in cryptocurrency and especially in Bitcoin. Now, I'm not here to give my own predictions for what I think will happen to Bitcoin in the market, but I just want to draw people's attention to some of the analysis that's been done, and also how that analysis can be somewhat manipulated or at least presented in different ways to present a certain outcome. And so I encourage everyone to make their own analysis on what they think the future will hold. But in particular, I want to take a look at some of the Bitcoin graphs and how they've been compared to some of the previous historical events we've seen in the financial markets. So I see Bitcoin compared a lot to two events, the dot-com bubble, and I also say compared to the tulip fever, which was when the price of tulips went through the roof and then crashed. And we're talking about tulips. It's not a technology, it's a commodity that existed. There was very specific reasons why we saw such a rise in the price of tulips back then, and then that eventual crash. And the only relation to Bitcoin, or certainly the charts or price of Bitcoin that we're seeing today, is really a line on the graph. As far as I'm concerned, I don't see any relation, and I don't see any valuable information coming out of the comparison. What I'm more interested in is comparing Bitcoin to the dot-com era. But once again, I want to make sure that people are understanding the information they're presenting, and a word of caution, especially when people are seeing graph comparisons to the dot-com era. So let's take a look at some of these graphs. So this first graph shows the historical price of Bitcoin. It's a graph I'm sure many people are familiar with. And it shows the long flat line, which was the quiet days of Bitcoin, a relatively low volatile price, and then a sudden rise in that price, a sudden spike, and then a crash. Now, if we overlay this onto the dot-com bubble, so I've taken a graph here from late 90s to early 2000s, and we can see the rise and fall of the NASDAQ Technology Index. If we overlay that onto the Bitcoin price, we can see that there is somewhat of a trend. So here's a catch. This is actually a Bitcoin price graph from 2010 to 2011, when the price of Bitcoin went from $5, rose up to about $40, and then promptly crashed again. And it's easy to see the similarities as far as the graph goes, but this only tells part of the story. As we know today, Bitcoin has a significantly higher value than $40. But as investors, as humans, we often have a short memory when it comes to looking at historical data. So let's look at this next graph. And no catches in this graph. This is a graph of the price of Bitcoin from 2011 to 2012. And funny enough, we can see that same comparison. It looks, once again, similar to that dot-com era crash. And if we look at the middle of the graph here, we see a little blip, which I've highlighted in red here. And that blip is that earlier rise and fall of Bitcoin, which now looks actually like quite a small bump in the historical price of Bitcoin. But once again, we see that trend. The price has gone up and obviously come down quite sharply. Looks similar to the dot-com era graph. Now let's look at the third graph. Now this is a graph of the price of Bitcoin between 2013 and 2014. Once again, we see a huge increase in the price of Bitcoin, what looks like a bubble bursting, that price dramatically decreasing. And again, once overlaid onto the dot-com era graph, we can see those same similarities, a huge increase in the price and then a sharp fall. But once again, if we look at the middle of the graph, we can now see two blips, which I've highlighted in red. That first blip being that initial surge from $5 to $40. That in that first graph looks like a huge crash, a huge bubble bursting. And then that second blip, which is that 2011-2012 price crash, which again, when compared in isolation to the dot-com graph, looks like a big rise and fall, but now this looks like another blip on the horizon. So let's look at the next graph. Spoiler alert, we're seeing the same trend again. Now this is a graph of Bitcoin from 2016 to 2017. And once again, what previously looked like huge increases and decreases or bubbles bursting in the price of Bitcoin now just look like blips on the horizon. And in fact, that first big rise that in that first graph looks like such an astronomical crash barely even features on this graph. You can only just make it out on the left-hand side here. And then I've also highlighted the other graphs that we've been looking at, and now they look insignificant compared to the current rise and fall of Bitcoin. Those blips are very, very insignificant. So now let's look at the final graph, and this is the historical price of Bitcoin up to today. And as we're reading in the media, once again, people are comparing this to the .com graph. And once again, there appears to be somewhat of a match. We've seen a big price increase, a big price drop. But once again, I want to draw your attention to the previous spikes that we just looked at, which once again are looking like very insignificant spikes on the journey of Bitcoin's price rise. So what I really want to get across is be careful and make your own analysis when you're seeing comparisons to historical events. History can tell us a lot about what we should expect in the future, but it can also be very misleading. Just because something happened before doesn't mean it can happen again. It's also very easy to mold the current facts to historical data. Honestly, I don't really think there is a lot of correlation between the .com era and the blockchain era. The only relation is that it's both based on technology. But as far as the trends that we're going to see, I mean, there's huge differences between internet technology, blockchain technology, and crypto. And the similarities that we're seeing are very skin deep. And I don't think that we can really make any comparisons to the current Bitcoin price environment, the current crypto price environment, and historical data, especially when it's taken so much out of context. So when you're looking at Bitcoin graphs or looking at comparisons, please make your own analysis, and do remember that these current large appreciations in the value of Bitcoin may look large today, but where are we going to be in 6 months, a year's time? Are we going to be looking at a much higher Bitcoin price, and then looking back on where we are today, which is early 2018, and seeing the current big price rally and crash as just another blip on the graph? I'll let you make your own analysis. Thanks for listening.